I remember the moment I realized I had been poisoned. My throat constricted as Michael raised his wine glass in a toast, his eyes gleaming with something too unreadable to name. Ashley sat across from us, her smile sharp, her posture relaxed, as though the celebration wasn't masking something far more sinister. The lobster had tasted off, but I dismissed it, too excited about the upcoming oncology conference to care. My research was finally at the precipice of changing the world, and I had foolishly believed the people closest to me wanted to witness that triumph. As I collapsed, my vision blurring and my breath thinning, Michael caught me with practiced concern, already dialing for help. Before I continue narrating the story of Jennifer Walsh, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. The emergency room lights blurred overhead as I slipped in and out of consciousness, Ashley's voice drifting in clinical detachment. "It mimics a shellfish allergy perfectly," she told the nurse, her tone unnervingly calm for someone who had just witnessed her mentor's collapse. I tried to respond, but my limbs refused to move, and my tongue lay heavy in my mouth like stone. Michael squeezed my hand, tears pricking his eyes like he was heartbroken, but his grip was too rehearsed, too perfectly timed. They thought they had buried me in that moment, rendering me helpless, both body and mind. But what they didn't know was that my body had failed me, not my mind. My thoughts remained sharp, every word spoken around me burning itself into memory. They spoke freely in my hospital room, unaware that I heard every word, every plan, every stolen patent and publication draft. Ashley's voice trembled with ambition, not guilt, as she pointed to my research notes and whispered about transitioning the legacy. Michael, once the man who vowed to love me through sickness and health, stood silently complicit, photographing my life's work with surgical precision. I had built my cancer research from grief, from my mother's death, from late nights sobbing over lab results while holding her picture in trembling hands. The goal had always been to make treatment affordable, to save families from the agony of choosing between rent and survival. Every molecular diagram, every protein sequence carried her memory within it, encoded not just in data but in love. And now these two, one my husband, the other my student, had reduced it to a stepping stone for their own ascent. But they underestimated the fire that tragedy forges inside you. The weeks that followed blurred into a choreography of betrayal, staged hospital visits and whispered plotting. Michael visited every morning with flowers, the same roses he once gave me on anniversaries now rebranded as props in his devoted husband act. Ashley played the part of concerned protege so well the nurses cried when she left the room. They told her how lucky I was to have such caring people. I wanted to scream, to rip off the blanket of lies and expose them both, but I had to wait. Time passed, and I played my part perfectly. Confused, mute, slow to respond, my neurologist nodded gravely when I struggled to remember the names of basic compounds. But at night, I practiced molecular equations in my head and imagined the day I would return. I replayed every conversation, cataloged every stolen document, mapped out every email I saw them print in my hospital room. I wasn't broken. I was rebuilding. My chance came when Dr. Elena Petrov reached out through an encrypted channel, her message a lifeline from a past that hadn't forgotten me. She had worked with me years ago during a molecular synthesis symposium in Geneva, and she knew the depth of my understanding. "Jennifer, if you're reading this yourself, then I know the reports of your decline are lies," she wrote. I cried for the first time since the poisoning, not out of sadness, but because someone finally saw through the fog they'd painted around me. With Elena's help, I built a private network of international collaborators who still respected the work that had once made me a rising star. I created a shell company, Biochem Innovations, a name that meant nothing on the surface but would soon carry the weight of revolution. Through it, I licensed my own discoveries, rerouted grants under new authorship, and began the quiet war of reclaiming my legacy. Dr. Hassan in Cairo began testing my compounds, while Dr. Chin in Singapore developed scalable production protocols. Every success pulled a thread from the web of lies Michael and Ashley had built. They continued presenting my early research like it was their own, never realizing the world had already moved on. I watched Michael on stage at the Piton Awards, accepting an honor for discoveries he couldn't even explain when questioned by experts. He quoted lines from my personal journal, phrases I'd written through tears after losing my mother, words he hadn't earned the right to utter. Ashley beamed from the front row, basking in the glow of stolen light. I sat in the audience, anonymous and still in my wheelchair, recording every word. Each applause was a nail in the coffin they had built for themselves. The performance continued at home, where I acted dazed, grateful, fragile. Michael whispered encouragements to me like a script he'd memorized, always careful not to show impatience. But his confidence made him sloppy, and I began lifting fingerprints, collecting receipts, and recording conversations. Every document he printed, every login Ashley used in our house, I traced and stored in encrypted drives. They handed me the rope, without realizing I was braiding it into a noose. My final act of deception came in the form of an email to Michael from Biochem Innovations, requesting an interview. He didn't even flinch. He was too blinded by ambition to consider who might be behind the offer. I watched him that morning polishing his shoes, straightening his tie, eyes lit with the hunger of a man about to grasp everything he thought he deserved. Ashley arrived with flashcards and coffee, rehearsing pitch lines, brushing invisible lint off his jacket like a devoted co-founder. They had no idea I'd be sitting across from them in that boardroom. The conference room at Biochem Innovations was sleek and understated, glass walls lined with neutral artwork and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown. I sat at the head of the table, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit and minimalist gold accessories, flanked by Elena and Dr. Chin. Every detail of the room had been curated for this moment, including the seating chart that placed Michael and Ashley directly across from me. The receptionist had welcomed them warmly, not betraying that their interview was actually a tribunal in disguise. As they stepped inside, I watched Michael's face collapse the moment his eyes met mine. Ashley stood frozen in the doorway, her breath audibly catching in her throat, her confidence evaporating like steam. Her usual self-assurance flickered into something smaller, panic, disbelief, humiliation, all fighting for space. Michael blinked rapidly, his mouth slightly open, caught between a greeting and a confession. I didn't offer a smile, nor did I rise. I simply tilted my head slightly, watching the storm settle behind his eyes. "Thank you both for coming," I said calmly, my voice the first real sound they'd heard in the vacuum of their unraveling. To the untrained eye, I must have looked like someone reborn, my posture straight, my tone unshaken, my presence undeniable. I had worn the necklace Michael once gave me on our second anniversary, not out of sentiment, but strategy. Elena passed me the portfolio of evidence like it was a menu, her fingers brushing mine in silent solidarity. Ashley tried to speak first, but Michael placed a hand on her wrist, silencing her before the damage could deepen. "Jennifer," he said finally, his voice hoarse with disbelief, "we thought you died?" I offered, my lips curled slightly at the edge, no more than a ghost of a smile. Ashley's eyes darted between me and the panel behind me, recognizing the international faces she had once name-dropped in emails she wasn't authorized to read. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make them squirm, to feel the gravity of what they had walked into. Elena leaned forward and clasped her hands gently on the table. "Let's begin the interview," she said crisply, not missing a beat. "We're curious to hear how you claim to have developed these findings." Michael attempted to recover, launching into a rehearsed summary of his research. My research, carefully recited but hollow in its depth. He spoke in generalities, avoiding any theoretical frameworks or practical methodologies that would expose his lack of comprehension. Ashley jumped in with data points, each one an echo of the presentations they'd given before, each one carefully cribbed from documents I had spent nights perfecting. Their tone was polished, their delivery smooth, but their words rang empty against the steel of truth. I let them speak, uninterrupted, knowing the fall would only be more satisfying the higher they climbed. Halfway through their pitch, I slid a folder across the table labeled with a single word: receipts. Elena opened it slowly and revealed a meticulously curated set of evidence: time-stamped photos, audio recordings, encrypted email archives. Michael's voice blared from a hidden speaker as one of the recordings played, describing the compound Ashley had used to simulate my allergy. His tone was analytical, even proud, detailing how the reaction would mimic a fatal shellfish response without ever leaving a trail. Ashley's voice followed, cool and detached, discussing the timeline for my expected cognitive decline. Michael's hand trembled as he reached for the water glass, his confident exterior cracking as his crimes played back to him in stereo. Ashley turned pale, her grip tightening around the arms of her chair, her body rigid like she feared even the table would reject her. Their presentation materials now looked ridiculous, props in a play whose director had returned from the dead. Dr. Hassan raised his eyebrows, unimpressed, and said, "It seems your understanding of molecular delivery systems is limited to the parts you stole." Ashley flinched, but Michael said nothing, his face blank as he calculated the fastest route out of humiliation. "You poisoned me," I said simply, my voice measured but resolute. "Then you stole my work, my legacy, and built careers on the ashes of someone you believed couldn't fight back." I didn't raise my voice or slam the table. I didn't need to. Truth didn't require theatrics when the evidence screamed louder than fury ever could. "You thought I was gone," I continued, leaning forward, "but all you did was force me to build something greater, without the weight of your betrayal holding me back." They didn't respond. What could they possibly say that wouldn't sound hollow or grotesque? Elena reached for the final envelope, pulling out the legal documents prepared weeks in advance. Inside were formal charges to be filed with their respective universities and institutions: attempted murder, academic fraud, intellectual theft. Every signature, every timestamp, every thread of their conspiracy was cataloged and cross-referenced. "You won't be speaking at conferences again," Elena said matter-of-factly, "unless they're hosted inside correctional facilities." I watched Ashley's lip quiver before she finally whispered, "We didn't know it would go this far." The room went cold in an instant, as if her cowardice had dropped the temperature by 10 degrees. "You planned a medical attack that could have killed me," I replied, my eyes locking on hers with clinical precision. "You didn't worry about how far it would go until you saw it circling back." Michael sank in his seat, the realization dawning that the company he had hoped would launch him into biotech fame was the one that would publicly dismantle him. I stood then, calmly and deliberately, collecting the evidence folder like a final chapter closing itself. The room remained silent as I turned my back on the people who had once eaten at my dinner table and cheered at my professional milestones. Elena, Dr. Chin, and Dr. Hassan rose behind me in unison, their loyalty hard-earned and built from something real. Before I exited, I paused by the glass doors and looked over my shoulder. "Security will see you out," I said. "But don't worry, this story is just beginning." The moment I stepped out of that boardroom, the weight I'd carried for years began to loosen, thread by thread. The hallway outside was flooded with natural light, warm and soft like the kind that filters through hospital blinds, only this time it didn't feel like a cage. I inhaled deeply, letting the scent of polished wood and clean air fill my lungs, so different from the sterile sting of antiseptic. Elena placed a hand gently on my shoulder, grounding me in the present before our team dispersed to prepare for the next phase. We had exposed them, but the real justice was only beginning. Back in my office, the mood was quiet but electric, a kind of charged stillness that followed seismic impact. Dr. Weber joined via secure video call, his face beaming with restrained pride as we debriefed the confrontation. "Their expressions were worth every encrypted message and midnight file transfer," he said, sipping from a porcelain mug that read, "Science wins." Dr. Chin nodded beside me, tapping through a compliance checklist that ensured none of our evidence would be questioned in court. Elena leaned back in her chair, lacing her fingers across her stomach, her satisfaction evident in the curve of her smile. Outside, Biochem Innovations buzzed with its usual energy. Technicians in lab coats darted through glass corridors, analysts reviewed global supply data, and researchers discussed the latest protein folding simulations. No one walking those halls would suspect that, just hours earlier, the company's founder had delivered a career-ending reckoning to 2 academic frauds. That was the power of precision. Real justice didn't require shouting or spectacle. It only needed truth, timing, and preparation. I spent the afternoon reviewing international rollout plans, my notes annotated with patient testimonials that reminded me why I began this work in the first place. Names and stories blurred across the screen. Mothers, fathers, daughters. Lives changed by research that came from grief and determination, not greed. By evening, news had begun circulating through the academic networks. Anonymous posts appeared on researcher forums, sharing grainy photos from the biochem lobby and whispering about the surprise CEO reveal that had turned the biotech world upside down. Was it really her? One user posted under the tag LabRat93. I thought she was in cognitive rehab. Replies flooded in, dissecting the impossibility of my survival, the implications of what it meant if I had been aware the whole time. None of them had answers, only questions, and that uncertainty fed the storm I had been waiting to unleash. The next day, I released an open letter through Biochem's official channels, 4 paragraphs, clinically worded but sharp enough to draw blood. I didn't name Michael or Ashley directly. I didn't need to. I spoke of betrayal within institutions, of research stolen by those entrusted to protect it, and the systems that enabled such violations through silence and bureaucracy. We must value scientific integrity above convenience, I wrote. And remember that behind every molecule is a story, a memory, a promise. The letter went viral within hours, retweeted by Nobel laureates, quoted in global publications, and dissected on academic panels from Boston to Berlin. Ashley's university was the first to respond publicly, issuing a bland statement about, quote, ongoing investigations into potential misconduct. But behind the scenes, the fallout had already begun. Her email access revoked, her lab appointments canceled, her conference invitations rescinded. I had anticipated her defense, her attempts to frame herself as a misguided mentee manipulated by an older, more experienced partner. But the audio files told a different story, one of precision, premeditation, and chilling ambition. She hadn't just followed Michael's lead. She had held the scalpel herself. Michael, ever the strategist, remained silent longer, likely calculating his options with the same cold logic he once used to poison me. But silence could only protect him for so long, especially when the press unearthed patent filings in his name, files that matched the exact phrasing and diagrams from my original research logs. A reporter from Medical Horizons requested an interview with Biochem, and I agreed, under the condition that we go off record. She was young, sharp-eyed, and well-informed, her questions laced with both curiosity and quiet rage. "You're not just telling a story," she said as we wrapped. "You're setting a precedent." The next morning, the article dropped, titled, "The Woman Who Outsmarted Death," and took down a lie with her. It chronicled the poisoning, the betrayal, the wheelchair performance, and the rise of biochem, all told without ever naming my attackers. The restraint made it more powerful, leaving readers to connect the dots as universities scrambled to release statements distancing themselves from the 2 disgraced researchers. Comment sections exploded with debate, admiration, and demands for institutional reform. For the first time, I saw people calling for accountability, not just from Michael and Ashley, but for the systems that had tried to erase me. I spent the following week in Singapore, touring our new production facility with Dr. Chin and overseeing the final tests before global shipment began. Walking those halls, watching researchers handle compounds I had once mixed alone in a dimly lit university lab, was surreal. Every vial, every centrifuge, every calibration was a step closer to saving someone else's mother, sister, child. I stood at the observation window and allowed myself a full breath of pride. Pure, undiluted, earned. Dr. Chin approached quietly and said, "You've turned grief into something the world can actually hold." At night, I returned to my suite overlooking the harbor, the city lights shimmering like equations across the water. I read letters from patients whose tumors had shrunk, whose side effects had lessened, whose lives had been extended because of the treatment we'd developed. Each testimonial closed with some variation of, "Thank you for not giving up," and I held those words close like armor. When my phone buzzed with Michael's name, I stared at it for a full minute before answering. "Jennifer," he said quietly, "I know I don't deserve to ask you this, but I need a job." For a moment, I didn't respond. I simply listened to his breathing, shallow and uneven like someone walking barefoot across shattered glass. The audacity of the request didn't surprise me as much as the timing. The article had only been out for 3 days. "I don't have anywhere else to go," he continued, each word steeped in quiet desperation, the kind I used to mistake for vulnerability. The same voice that once soothed me to sleep was now asking for a lifeline from the woman he tried to kill. I said nothing and let silence wrap around us like a closing door. "I lost my tenure," he added, voice cracking slightly. "They pulled the grants, rescinded my courses. I've been blacklisted from every lab I've reached out to." The irony almost made me laugh, but bitterness had long since burned out, leaving only precision. I watched the harbor lights flicker in rhythmic lines, letting the moment stretch far past comfort. He had used silence as a weapon in the hospital room where I lay paralyzed, letting Ashley narrate my future in clinical tones. Now it was my turn to wield it like a scalpel. "I read the article," he said finally, desperation giving way to quiet resignation. "You didn't name me. You could have, but you didn't." I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him that I hadn't named him, because it was more damning to let the world figure it out. Letting people uncover his betrayal made it more real, more inescapable, and far more destructive than a single headline. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, firm, and devoid of the emotion he hoped to manipulate. "You didn't lose everything because of me, Michael," I said. "You lost everything because you gambled with someone else's life and treated their legacy like a ladder." I could hear him exhale sharply, the kind of sound that came when someone realized they weren't getting the absolution they expected. "You and Ashley made a choice," I continued, "and now the world has made one in return." There was no anger in my tone, just certainty. "I'm not asking for sympathy," he said, though the plea was threaded through every syllable. "I'm asking for a chance to work, to do something that matters again." The Michael the First had once loved would have never said those words. He wouldn't have needed to. But the man on the other end of the phone was a ghost of that version, brittle and unraveling under the weight of his own decisions. "I can't undo what we did," he whispered, "but I can still help, somehow." The part of me that had once built a life with him stirred faintly, but it was not affection, it was recognition. I remembered the man who used to debate protein structures with me over pancakes, the one who held my hand during my mother's funeral. But that man had died the moment he watched me struggle to breathe and did nothing to help. The man on the phone was a shadow, and shadows didn't get second chances. "You'll get a severance package from the university," I said. "You should use it to disappear quietly." I ended the call without waiting for a reply and tossed the phone onto the coffee table, its screen flashing briefly before going dark. I didn't need his response. I'd already heard every word of it in the silence that followed. Outside, the wind picked up over the harbor, rustling the curtains like soft applause. The last remnants of him fell away in that moment, not with fury, but with finality. I was not his savior, and he was no longer my story. Back in Seattle, Biochem was preparing for the first wave of full-scale distribution. Dr. Hassan had confirmed regulatory approval in 6 countries, while Dr. Chin finalized agreements with 3 pharmaceutical suppliers in Southeast Asia. Elena managed European legal protections, ensuring no one could lay claim to our intellectual property again. My calendar filled with speaking engagements, clinical trial reviews, and ethics roundtables. But I reserved every Friday afternoon for something else, something quieter. I spent those hours at a community clinic on the city's east side, where patients didn't care about awards or journals, just results. The lead physician, Dr. Morales, welcomed me without pretense, grateful for the help and curious about nothing beyond competence. We administered early-stage treatments to patients who had run out of options: single mothers, retirees, underinsured workers. Their gratitude didn't come in applause or articles. It came in steady breath, lowered pain, restored sleep. It was there, among them, that my mother's memory felt closest. One Friday, an elderly woman named Irene held my hand after her session and said, "You look like someone who's been through the fire." Her grip was thin but sure, the kind that came from living through things instead of talking about them. "People always think the fire breaks you," she continued, "but sometimes it's just refining you into who you were supposed to be." I nodded, unable to find words because hers were already enough. That night, I returned home and lit a candle for my mother, letting the flame dance while I sat in stillness. The following Monday, I received a thick envelope at my office. No return address, just my name written in blocky, uncertain handwriting. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, clearly taken in secret. Ashley stood in most of them, always mid-conversation, always in places she wasn't supposed to be. Universities, laboratories, private conferences. Each one was stamped with a date and time, accompanied by grainy voice transcripts describing new targets. My fingers tightened around the edges of the pages as the full picture came into focus. Ashley hadn't gone quietly. She had been planting seeds again, seeking new mentors, new research to appropriate, using her same innocent charm and academic ambition. But this time, someone else had been watching. A handwritten note was tucked at the bottom of the stack, scrawled in red ink. "I thought you should know she hasn't changed." No signature, no explanation, just a warning. The fire, it seemed, hadn't refined her at all. I laid the photographs out on my desk in a precise grid, each image a snapshot of ambition unrepentant. Ashley wasn't rebuilding. She was repeating, using different institutions and new faces, but the same blueprint. Her posture in the photos told me more than the transcripts could. Shoulders relaxed, eyes bright, head tilted just enough to feign curiosity. She was embedded again, the same way she had embedded herself into my research, my trust, my life. But this time, the alert hadn't come from someone she betrayed. It came from someone who had seen her coming. I contacted Elena immediately, forwarding the scans and noting timestamps with a red pen. "She's attempting replication," I told her over a secure line, watching the file upload tick toward completion. Elena's voice was calm, but I heard the shift in her tone, a barely restrained edge of disgust. "She's not just stealing," she said. "She's trying to rebuild what we already perfected, and she's targeting junior researchers who don't know her history." That was the most dangerous part. Not that Ashley was trying again, but that she might succeed with people who didn't recognize the predator behind the mentor mask. I reviewed the names from the transcripts. 2 postdocs in Boston, a visiting biochemist from Mumbai, and 1 university affiliate in Prague. They were all early career scientists, eager for guidance, their emails filled with polite deference and enthusiastic gratitude. I knew that tone. I'd once spoken with it, trusted with it, been shattered with it. The photographs weren't just warnings. They were maps to the next stage of her manipulation. We decided not to contact the universities directly. Institutions like to bury their shame unless forced into sunlight. Instead, Dr. Chin suggested we create a private mentorship network for emerging researchers, a platform safeguarded by our coalition. It would operate under Biochem's nonprofit arm and offer ethical support, technical resources, and one-on-one guidance for scientists in vulnerable academic positions. Elena volunteered to manage the European wing, while Dr. Hassan offered clinical internships through his hospital system. We would build the protection Ashley had never faced. The program launched within 3 weeks, quietly but efficiently, spreading through encrypted academic channels and professional communities. Within a month, over 700 researchers joined, each one submitting background forms and passing confidentiality agreements. Many had stories, projects appropriated, credit withheld, invitations rescinded after presenting controversial data. We didn't publicize Ashley's name, but we shared her tactics through anonymized case studies. The pattern was unmistakable, and those who had lived it knew exactly who the stories were about. Late one evening, I received a message through the mentorship platform, tagged as urgent. A young researcher named Nadia had been approached by a visiting scholar who had offered to help restructure her treatment delivery proposal. The name used was Ann Kim, but the phrasing in the messages mirrored Ashley's so closely it felt cut and pasted. Nadia sent a PDF of the proposed edits, and I recognized my own delivery equations embedded within them, adjusted slightly, just enough to pass most software plagiarism checks. I felt cold clarity settle over me like armor. I asked Nadia to hold off responding, telling her we were looking into the source. Quietly, I flew to Boston the next morning under the pretense of visiting one of our clinic partners. Elena met me in Cambridge, and together we arranged a private meeting with Nadia under full confidentiality. She was young, brilliant, and terrified, but also resolute. She told me the equations came from her previous mentor who passed away. Nadia explained, showing us the message thread. That was Ashley's new angle. Tragedy as camouflage, rewriting her history to erase what the world now knew. She played the victim of academic loss, casting herself as the steward of a legacy she had tried to erase with poison and theft. Nadia's instincts had kicked in when Ashley's suggestions began overtaking the project itself. Subtle shifts at first, then bold reconfigurations. It didn't feel like support, Nadia said. It felt like possession. I saw in her the same fear I once ignored. We gave Nadia protection through the mentorship network, legal backing, independent data storage, and encrypted email filters. Within days, 2 other mentees from separate institutions flagged similar behavior from Ann Kim. We compared messages, timestamps, and file structures. The metadata revealed identical authorship. Ashley had been bold, far bolder than I expected after what she'd already lost. But boldness without caution is its own form of downfall. Dr. Weber suggested that we report the findings to the World Conference on Research Integrity, whose next summit was in Vienna. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ashley had once dreamed of presenting there. Instead, she would now be the centerpiece of a cautionary panel on research ethics, pseudonym redacted, but her blueprint unmistakable. I agreed, but with one condition. I wanted to deliver the keynote. My speech was titled, "The Fragility of Truth in the Hands of the Trusted." I didn't name Ashley, but I didn't need to. Scientists recognized footprints better than most. I spoke of systems that failed to protect integrity, of legacy wrapped in vulnerability, of betrayal masked as mentorship. I ended not with retribution, but with a pledge to never again allow silence to shelter theft disguised as guidance. The room erupted in standing applause, not because I had exposed her again, but because I had turned pain into protocol. Back in Seattle, the spring sun filtered through my office windows as Biochem's next shipment prepared for international release. New compounds were entering Phase 3 trials, ones Ashley had never touched, never known, never infected with her duplicity. Michael hadn't reached out again, and I suspected he wouldn't. He was a man who could fade quietly when the mirror turned. Ashley, on the other hand, had once again chosen noise. But this time, the world had heard it before. 1 month after the Vienna summit, Biochem Innovations was approached by the International Medical Ethics Consortium for collaboration on new global research protocols. They had watched our mentorship platform grow and wanted to integrate our systems into a broader initiative for academic transparency. The irony wasn't lost on me. What had started as a personal recovery had evolved into structural reform. Lena called it poetic justice, but I saw it as necessity carved from loss. The world wasn't changing on its own. We had forced its hand with evidence and conviction. We flew to Geneva for the official partnership signing, our names now etched beside institutions that once ignored stories like mine. As I stood under the warm lights of the press room, flanked by Elena and Dr. Hassan, I felt the weight of my mother's photograph and the locket beneath my collar. She had died quietly, but her memory now echoed across continents, pushing medicine toward justice she never received. A reporter asked me what had driven me through recovery, betrayal, and war. I said, "The people we lose often become the compass for the people we become." After the event, I returned to my hotel room and found another envelope slipped under the door. The handwriting was unfamiliar this time, looping, jagged, uncertain. Inside was a single printed article from an obscure academic blog, criticizing Biochem's rise as a media construct hiding behind trauma narratives. Someone had scrawled across the top in red ink, "You haven't won. You just bought better lighting." There was no name, no signature, just bitterness sealed inside anonymity. I showed the note to Elena, who raised an eyebrow but didn't react beyond that. "Desperation always reaches for shadows when it can't touch the source," she said, folding the paper and dropping it into the hotel's fireplace. It didn't matter whether Ashley or one of her sympathizers had written it. The tone was unmistakably defensive. The truth didn't need disguises, but guilt always did. We didn't respond publicly, choosing instead to continue the work they claimed we couldn't have earned. Back in Seattle, Biochem opened its first walk-in treatment center, designed for underserved patients who couldn't afford private hospitals. The clinic was modest, no marble floors or decorative lighting, just clean lines, efficient systems, and compassionate staff. I walked through the lobby the morning it opened, shaking hands, offering words of encouragement, and quietly observing every corner. One of the nurses, Clara, greeted me with a grin that reminded me of those first months in the lab, before betrayal, before war, before survival became a second job. "They're calling this place the Miracle Room already," she whispered, motioning toward a row of exam doors. There, a young boy named Emil was receiving the 4th round of our trial therapy. His mother hugged me without warning, her eyes wet with something deeper than gratitude. "They said we'd have to choose between this and rent," she said, her voice breaking. "Now we don't have to choose between hope and a home." I held her a moment longer than necessary, not because she needed it, but because I did. That evening I walked home instead of taking the car, the Seattle skyline sharp against the twilight. Every building, every street seemed to hold a memory. My first apartment, the bookstore where I hid from grief, the coffee shop where I once drafted my first research grant. These weren't just places. They were proof that I had outlived their expectations. The shadows that once owned me now cowered behind glass and concrete, powerless to rewrite what I had reclaimed. I moved forward not as a survivor, but as an architect of the world I'd been denied. Inside my apartment, the scent of jasmine from the window box reminded me of hospital corridors, and nights I prayed I'd wake up different. I poured a glass of wine and sat on the floor beside the coffee table, spreading out treatment success letters from around the world. Each letter bore a stamp from a different country: Kenya, Argentina, Iceland, Thailand, all reporting recovery, remission, survival. Every story ended the same. "We couldn't have done it without your formula." But I knew they didn't just mean the compound, they meant the fight. Michael sent another message that night, this time through a legal intermediary, requesting a meeting about a matter of mutual interest. I read it 3 times before forwarding it to Elena, who responded within minutes. "We'll take the meeting," she wrote, "but only on your terms." I didn't want revenge anymore. I already had something far more precise: legacy. Still, there were debts that couldn't be settled through silence alone. We arranged the meeting at Biochem's satellite office in Vancouver, choosing neutral ground. The building overlooked the harbor, far from the Seattle landmarks Michael once haunted. He arrived in a gray suit that hung too loose on his frame, the sharp lines of his face dulled by stress and aging. Ashley wasn't with him, and I didn't ask why. He carried only one thing: a slim file folder clutched to his chest like a confession. We entered the glass conference room without ceremony. No coffee, no small talk, no handshakes. Elena sat beside me, silent but watchful, while Dr. Chin remained on video conference from Singapore. Michael looked at me, not with guilt or remorse, but exhaustion, the expression of a man who finally understood the cost of every choice. "I came to offer you the last piece," he said, placing the folder on the table without sliding it forward. I made no move to reach for it. "What piece?" I asked, the words cool but not cruel. He exhaled slowly, the way people do when they know they're about to sever the last tie they've clung to. Ashley had recordings I didn't know about. Audio logs, backup files, a failsafe in case I ever turned on her. Elena leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpening like a scalpel. She kept them on a private cloud, he continued, and I only found out when the last university revoked her research privileges. She planned to frame you if we ever got caught, said it would make her the survivor, the betrayed student, the moral one. He looked up at me now, eyes raw, voice hoarse. I was too much of a coward to stop her, but I can at least help you finish this. Elena reached across the table, lifting the folder slowly, her eyes never leaving Michael's face. Inside were printed access credentials, metadata screenshots, and a notarized affidavit signed 2 weeks earlier in Seattle. I recognized Ashley's writing in the cloud directory names, abbreviated versions of my initials alongside file codes from our old lab. Elena handed the packet to Dr. Chin on screen, who immediately began the process of verifying the links through a secure forensic platform. Michael stayed silent, his eyes lowered, the posture of a man who knew there was no redemption, only restitution. "This is everything?" I asked, keeping my voice flat, controlled. He nodded once, not trusting himself to speak again. The stillness in the room pressed against the windows like fog, dense and full of everything unsaid. I thought of how easily he had once said, "We should celebrate," the night he led me to the meal that almost killed me. Now here he was, trying to give me the weapon to dismantle the last illusion they had built. Dr. Chin confirmed the contents live from Singapore. Her screen split into file trees, each branch unfurling into hundreds of Ashley's voice logs and internal monologues. Most were recordings of planning sessions, Michael and Ashley discussing how to manipulate the research committee, how to delay my patent submissions, how to erase portions of my lab notes. One recording caught my attention immediately. Ashley rehearsing her statement for the university board, framing herself as the lone student who tried to carry on the work of her fallen mentor. Her voice was calm, almost reverent, like she truly believed the story would sell. She hadn't just plotted betrayal, she'd already scripted her own sainthood. I asked Elena to save that file first, then turned back to Michael. "Why give it up now?" I asked, not out of sympathy, but curiosity. He looked up at me then, and for the first time since that night in the hospital, his expression held no mask. "Because you're not the one who needs to forgive me," he said. "And because I'm tired of living as someone else's accomplice." I nodded once, the gesture more acknowledgement than absolution. Elena closed the folder and said, "Our legal team will take it from here," her tone clinical. Michael stood, but didn't move toward the door right away. "I won't contact you again," he said quietly, "but thank you for not turning this into spectacle." I didn't answer as he left, and I didn't watch him go. Back in Seattle, our team convened to determine how to handle the newly acquired materials. Ashley had already been discredited in multiple academic circles, but these recordings would seal her reputation permanently. The most damning part wasn't just the theft or deception. It was the casual tone in her voice as she described my condition. "She won't know what happened, even if she lives," Ashley had said in one file, sipping something as ice clinked gently in the background. "We'll frame it as a tragic allergic episode, and then we just carry the torch." Dr. Weber's voice was steel when he listened to the first 5 logs. "She weaponized mentorship like a surgical tool," he said, "and she used grief as her camouflage." The board agreed unanimously to release a joint ethics report to every institution that had accepted her for a fellowship or speaking engagement. No dramatic press release, no public shaming, just the facts, delivered with surgical accuracy. Let her face the silence she once built for me. By the end of the week, Ashley's name was removed from every journal she'd recently published in. Retractions appeared quietly, methodically, like erasing pencil marks from the margins of history. One journal editor sent us a private message. "We apologize for not questioning the inconsistencies earlier." Another added, "Her technical gaps were always noticeable, but we assumed stress." That assumption, the benefit of the doubt, was the same cloak that had allowed her to step over me. Nadia, the postdoc in Boston, sent a short message after hearing the news. "Thank you for warning me before she became my mentor." Others followed, not all in English, but all carrying the same tone: relief, gratitude, empowerment. We hadn't just dismantled Ashley's scheme. We'd disrupted a system that allowed it to flourish. Biochem's mentorship network doubled in size by the end of the quarter. I returned to the clinic the following Friday, the jasmine in bloom again, as the city eased into a warmer spring. Emil had completed his treatment cycle and brought a drawing of our lab, a crooked building with cartoon beakers and stick-figure scientists. He handed it to me shyly, and his mother hugged me again, stronger this time. "He wants to be a scientist now," she whispered. "He says he wants to fix things like you do." That evening, I placed the drawing next to my mother's photo on my desk. It was imperfect and honest, two things I had learned to embrace again. I spent the weekend in quiet reflection, reviewing trial reports and planning a new outreach initiative for developing countries. Elena suggested naming it after my mother, and I agreed without hesitation. Project Marianne would bring cost-free cancer treatment access to rural hospitals across 5 continents. The first facility opened in Ghana 3 months later, with Dr. Hassan overseeing the rollout alongside local medical teams. Reports showed reduced mortality rates in the first 30 days, and treatment accessibility doubled by month 2. We sent mobile lab kits to the most remote communities, equipped with training guides and compound calibration devices. Biochem had grown into something more than a company. It was now a network of remembrance, of resistance, of reclamation. I was no longer just defending a legacy. I was building one that outpaced every attempt to steal it. On the anniversary of my mother's passing, I returned to the lab I once called home. It had been repurposed since my departure, but I stood at the doorway in silence, remembering the smell of ethanol and coffee and ambition. Michael's footsteps no longer echoed here, and Ashley's laughter had long since faded from its walls. The only sound was the quiet hum of new machines powered by someone else's dream. I smiled softly, knowing mine had never died. The walls of the old lab had been repainted, the floor buffed smooth, and the equipment mostly replaced, but I still recognized the outlines of my former life. The window by the far corner still caught morning light at just the right angle to illuminate where I once kept my mother's photograph. That desk was gone, but the memory remained, suspended like dust in the sunbeam. I stood there for a long time, letting the hum of progress buzz around me, untouched by what I had endured to make it here. The space was no longer mine, but the science it now fostered had been made possible by the truth I refused to let die. As I stepped back into the hallway, a graduate student brushed past, holding a stack of data sheets, her pace brisk with focus. She didn't know who I was, didn't glance twice. Just one more researcher in a building of ideas. It comforted me to know they were moving forward, without needing to remember the war. One fought in those walls. True legacy wasn't about monuments or plaques. It was about momentum. I left without speaking to anyone, content to let silence be the ribbon that tied off the past. Biochem's expansion continued rapidly, our headquarters adding a second research tower and a clinical division dedicated to pediatric oncology. Dr. Chin developed a scaled-down manufacturing system that allowed hospitals to produce localized batches of treatment with minimal infrastructure. That innovation alone tripled our reach, especially in regions where imports were too slow or expensive. Elena handled our licensing partnerships with surgical precision, ensuring no entity could dilute or exploit the mission. Together, we operated less like a company and more like a global organism, living, growing, adapting. Donations to Project Marianne poured in after our first year, many from families whose lives had been saved by the treatment protocols we developed. I wrote handwritten thank you notes to every donor under $1,000 and recorded personal videos for major benefactors. Not because I had to, but because people needed to know they weren't giving to a machine. They were investing in a woman who'd once been written off, and a promise that began beside a hospital bed. Each message ended the same. Your support doesn't build buildings, it builds survival. One afternoon, while reviewing a report on treatment efficacy in rural Colombia, my assistant knocked softly and entered my office with an envelope in hand. The handwriting was unmistakable. Michael's. It had been months since our last contact, and I hadn't expected anything further. I opened it slowly, half expecting bitterness, but found only a brief note and a check made out to Project Marianne. The amount wasn't large, but the gesture was heavier than the paper it wrote in on. For the mother I failed to respect, and the legacy I helped nearly destroy, the note read, "Do something better with it than I ever could." I didn't respond, didn't deposit the check immediately. I left it on my desk for 2 days, staring at it like a question I didn't know how to answer. Eventually, I endorsed the back and mailed it in, but I didn't include his name on any donor wall. Some debts aren't paid to be remembered, they're paid to stay buried. Ashley, on the other hand, had vanished. Her last known location was a canceled panel at a TechMed conference in Toronto, where organizers pulled her name after the audio files circulated. No legal charges had been filed, yet, but every institution she contacted was aware of who she was and what she'd done. Whispers about her behavior made their rounds in every serious research circle. Her name often met with a knowing pause or a cautious glance. She had become a case study in betrayal, not infamous, not criminal, but radioactive. A journalist contacted me asking for a follow-up interview, curious about the woman who reclaimed her name and built an empire from ashes. I declined. I didn't need another article, another profile, another headline. What I needed was more hours in the lab and fewer reminders of the poison I'd once tasted. There was still work to do, and I refused to let the world keep defining me by my survival instead of my science. Every Friday, I still walked to the East Side Clinic, where the walls smelled of disinfectant and hope. Patients didn't know my full story, and I didn't offer it. They only knew the medicine worked and the care was real. A teenager named Daniela once asked if I'd always been a doctor, and I smiled and said no, but I've always wanted to fix what's broken. She nodded like that made perfect sense, then went back to sketching stars in her notebook. Those were the moments that reminded me why I built this. During a quarterly update, Dr. Weber proposed opening a research center in South Africa to study cancer treatment outcomes across diverse genetic populations. The team agreed, and within 3 months we broke ground on the Cape Town Institute for Medical Equity, named not after any one person, but after the idea that everyone deserved a fighting chance. I traveled there for the ribbon cutting, standing beneath a bright sky that didn't feel heavy with memory. I gave a short speech, focused not on what had been taken from me, but on what we'd built since. Science without access is just a theory, I told the crowd, but science with equity is a revolution. As I walked off stage, a small girl in a white sundress tugged at my hand, holding out a pink flower she'd picked from the field beyond the tents. "My auntie said you made the medicine that helped her hair grow back," she said, her smile missing 2 front teeth. I knelt and accepted the flower, tears pressing behind my eyes, but I held them back with practiced grace. "Tell your auntie I'm glad," I said softly, placing the flower in my lapel like a medal. Some victories didn't come with applause, they came with bloom and breath. Later that night I stood at the balcony of the Institute, the city lights below soft and distant. My phone buzzed with a message from Elena. Final green light for the European distribution hub. Paris approved everything. I replied with a single word, "Excellent." Then I placed the phone down, closed my eyes and let the African wind pass through my hair. I didn't need to open my eyes to know I was no longer the woman left to die. Back in Seattle, the weeks passed in a quiet rhythm of progress, expansion, and introspection. The European hub had launched smoothly, and our outreach in Eastern Europe began showing promising early trials. We had crossed the threshold from survival into permanence. Biochem was no longer just a success story. It was a fixture in the world of equitable medicine. Even with the recognition, awards, and international collaborations, I stayed rooted in the quiet discipline of the work itself. After all the chaos, it was the routine, the science, the data, the mission that kept me whole. One morning, as I reviewed outcomes from our Nairobi program, my assistant knocked again. Same hesitant knock she always used when something unexpected waited on the other side. "You have a visitor," she said, holding a business card between 2 fingers. I took it slowly, expecting some journalist or board member's emissary, but the name etched into the card stopped me cold. Dr. Amanda Grayson, the newly appointed ethics chair at the university where Michael and I had once built our shared illusion, the institution that had quietly looked away when I was erased. I agreed to see her, not out of curiosity, but because I'd learned how much power there was in being the one who listens. Dr. Grayson entered with cautious steps, her shoulders square but her eyes scanning the room like someone stepping onto sacred ground. She looked to be in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and a file tucked under one arm. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," she said, voice neutral, practiced. I nodded once, offering her the seat across from me, but nothing more. She placed the file on the table between us without opening it. "I've spent the last 6 months reviewing the full scope of the events surrounding your departure," she said. "The university failed you, blatantly, repeatedly, and in ways that cannot be dismissed as bureaucratic oversight." Her hands remained still on the folder, not reaching for gestures or defenses. "I'm here to acknowledge that failure formally, and to ask if you'll allow us to correct the record, on paper, in public, and with permanence." For the first time in years, I felt something stir that wasn't rage or resolve, but something quieter, vindication. I opened the folder and found a multi-page declaration, stamped with official letterhead and signatures from the university's highest administrators. It outlined a full reinstatement of my title, the reversal of every research reassignment, and a formal apology to be published across multiple academic platforms. At the bottom was a note offering the opportunity to return as a guest lecturer, should I choose to accept. It was the kind of gesture they should have made 4 years ago, when I lay paralyzed while thieves rewrote my legacy. But I wasn't the same woman who needed that kind of validation anymore. "I appreciate the correction," I said, sliding the folder back across the table. "But I've built something far beyond that lab, and I won't be returning." Dr. Grayson nodded, unsurprised. "I thought you might say that," she replied, "but I still hope you'll allow us to host a public panel with you as the keynote speaker on scientific integrity and survivor-led reform." That offer I considered, if only because it would allow me to speak in the space where I was once silenced. The event was scheduled for the fall and titled Legacy and Liability, The Future of Ethics in Science. It sold out within hours, drawing students, faculty, and international observers curious about the woman whose silence had once been mistaken for defeat. When I took the stage, I didn't begin with revenge or loss. I began with a name. "My mother's name was Mary Ann," I told them, "and her death taught me that medical systems fail not only because of profit, but because of silence." The room quieted, and in that stillness, I planted seeds for a future I'd once been denied. I spoke of mentorship, of oversight, of the slow erosion of ethical lines when ambition outweighs accountability. I didn't name Michael or Ashley. I didn't need to. The facts stood on their own, no longer burdened by the weight of disbelief or power imbalance. Afterward, students formed a line down the hall just to ask questions, to thank me, to share their fears of becoming victims or perpetrators in systems still too slow to change. Each conversation reminded me that truth, once spoken, cannot be made small again. The next morning, a bouquet of blue delphiniums was waiting outside my hotel room, unsigned but unmistakable. It wasn't Michael. He wouldn't have chosen flowers my mother loved. It wasn't Elena or Dr. Chin either. They knew better than to leave anonymous gestures. I read the small card tucked within the stems. "Some truths grow back stronger after being buried. Thank you for digging yours out." I left the flowers in the lobby, letting their message bloom where others could see it. Autumn settled over Seattle with amber skies and the crisp scent of change. Biochem's new community lab opened downtown, a free access center where aspiring scientists could experiment, learn, and fail safely. It was my proudest achievement. Education without gatekeeping, research without predation. I visited often, offering guidance without fanfare, watching quietly as new minds uncovered new frontiers. Sometimes, I saw flashes of Ashley in the sharpest students, ambitious, curious, hungry, but now I had the tools to protect them from becoming predators or prey. One afternoon, Nadia visited the center during her fellowship break and brought news of her own. She had been accepted into a lead role on a global virology project, with full credit and funding. No shadow mentors, no stolen data, no whispered agendas. "You helped me believe it could be done right," she said, adjusting the visitor badge on her coat. I smiled and reminded her, "You're helping me prove it." We walked through the lab together, no longer mentor and mentee, but two women carrying torches through halls that had once gone dark. That evening, I returned to my office and opened my private research journal, the same one I had resurrected from storage years ago. I didn't write about Michael or Ashley. I didn't mention universities or lawsuits or stolen files. I wrote about Emil, Daniela, Nadia, names that didn't need to know betrayal to understand purpose. Then I closed the journal and looked at the framed photograph beside it. My mother, mid-laugh in the final year before the diagnosis. "I kept my promise," I said aloud to the empty room. "They didn't win." The wind moved through the slightly cracked window, carrying with it a familiar scent of jasmine. And for the first time since the night I was poisoned, I believed, deep in my marrow, that everything broken had been rebuilt stronger. Not because I fought back, but because I kept building. By winter, Biochem Innovations had expanded to 21 countries and operated 6 fully staffed mobile clinics in conflict zones and rural areas. Our research partnerships spanned continents, but the heart of the mission remained local, focused on patients who once would have been statistics. Every Thursday afternoon, I walked through our Seattle flagship center, clipboard in hand, pretending to be just another administrator. I still found solace in the simplicity of observation, smiling patients, the low murmur of consultations, the rhythmic beeping of machines doing their quiet work. My name didn't need to be on every wall, because my fingerprint was in every detail. Dr. Chin surprised me with a visit in mid-December, her coat dusted with snow and her energy, as always, unwavering. We met in the boardroom after hours, sipping ginger tea as she pulled up early results from our Brazil pilot. 2 weeks in, and outcomes are already exceeding projected survival rates, she said, her face softening with cautious pride. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently, a silent thank you for every midnight strategy call and every encrypted file transfer that kept our work safe. "It started with heartbreak," I said, "but it ends in healing." We finalized the rollout plan for the next region, northern India, where Dr. Hassan's team had already laid the groundwork. He sent video clips of patients waving at the camera, some wearing masks, others holding handwritten signs in Hindi that translated to, "Thank you for not forgetting us." Watching them, I remembered the nights I thought no one would remember me. Now thousands did, not because I was loud, but because I had been relentless. My mother had once said that legacy wasn't about being famous. It was about being unforgettable in the lives of people who mattered. The mentorship network, now known as the Walsh Circle, held its first in-person summit that winter, hosted in Toronto. Nadia gave the opening remarks, introducing stories from mentees who had reclaimed authorship, filed grievances, or simply found the strength to walk away from toxic advisors. Every success story was a mirror of the woman I once was, sitting in a hospital bed, trying to move my fingers while betrayal whispered beside me. But unlike me, they were never alone. They had structure, funding, allies, and names that couldn't be erased by academic politics. That, more than any lab result, was my proudest discovery. At the end of the summit, I was presented with a sculpture commissioned by the network, an abstract rendering of a double helix made entirely from recycled metals. It wasn't ornate or polished. It was layered, imperfect, beautiful in its resistance to uniformity. I stood beside it for a long time after the applause died down, fingers tracing the jagged edges where molecules met. "Science is survival," Nadia said as she joined me, "and this feels like proof." I nodded, my throat tight, knowing she was right. Proof made visible, permanent, and undeniably mine. News reached me in February that Michael had accepted a position as a remote reviewer for a small bioethics journal with no institutional ties. He hadn't returned to academia, nor had he published anything since the truth came out. It wasn't punishment, just a quiet exile, fitting for a man who once weaponized silence. He would live his life in footnotes now, his name unspoken in classrooms where he once lectured. I felt no triumph in that, only the calm that comes when the storm has passed and left nothing worth rebuilding. Ashley, as far as we knew, had relocated to a city in Eastern Europe under an assumed name, seeking work in a consultancy firm that dealt with pharmaceutical logistics. Her credentials remained technically valid, but her history followed her like smog, clouding every opportunity she approached. Institutions didn't need to blacklist her. Her patterns were now case studies in dozens of mentorship trainings. She had become a cautionary tale, and perhaps that was the most justice I could have hoped for. Some truths don't need to scream. They just echo in the spaces where ambition once roared. In late spring, I returned to the community clinic on the east side of town, where I had first found my footing after everything collapsed. The nurse at the front desk smiled when she saw me and handed me a clipboard, already filled out with my old volunteer badge clipped to the top. "They still ask about you," she said. "Some of the older patients call you the scientist who didn't wear heels." I laughed softly, remembering how often I had sat beside exam tables in sneakers, explaining cell behavior with pen sketches on appointment paper. I spent the afternoon assisting with intake forms, organizing lab kits, and helping a new staff member understand dosage charts. It was quiet work, simple and necessary, the kind of labor that didn't need headlines to feel essential. Near closing time, a middle-aged woman came in with her teenage daughter, asking about our newer immunotherapy trial. As the nurse explained the details, I caught the girl staring at the framed photo behind the desk, my mother's portrait, quietly placed there by Clara after the first treatment center opened. She didn't ask who the woman was, but she smiled at her like she understood. That evening, I returned to my apartment, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat in the armchair beside the window. The skyline shimmered with familiar lights, the ones I used to trace during nights I wasn't sure I'd survive. But now, the lights didn't look distant. They looked reachable. I opened my laptop and began drafting a new initiative, a research residency for students who'd lost family to unaffordable medicine, giving them full access to training, travel, and mentorship. I titled the proposal The Bridge Project, because that's what this had always been, a crossing from ruin to revolution. Weeks later, I received an invitation to attend an awards ceremony in Oslo. I didn't expect to win. The nomination alone had come as a surprise. But the thought of standing on a stage as a woman once left to die, now recognized for saving thousands, made me pause. Elena insisted I go, and Dr. Weber booked the flight before I could protest. As the plane ascended over the Pacific, I looked out at the clouds and thought about how far I'd come, not just geographically, but spiritually. The woman in the hospital bed was gone. In Oslo, I stepped onto the stage in a black suit and minimalist gold necklace, the same one I wore the day I exposed Michael and Ashley. The audience rose before I even spoke, not for the revenge I had executed, but for the life I had rebuilt. I wasn't saved by luck. I told them I was saved by truth and the will to keep speaking it, even when no one wanted to listen. A pause followed, filled with breath and weight. So this award belongs to every woman who was told to be quiet and chose instead to build. Thank you for listening to Jennifer's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.